Today we're going to look at generational differences. This is something that we deal with each and every day in our lives because we all know people that are from different generations. And especially today in the work world, we're seeing people work longer. They're retiring later. So we're going to see people that's really in 4 different generations. And hopefully this will help us in the work world, and this knowing the differences can help us in our family relations as well. Let's start off by looking at the Traditionalists, also called the World War II generation. Now, these are all just characteristics that are rules of thumbs. They really don't apply to every single person, but these characteristics do have a lot of value in the people and the segments that we look at in a population. These people were born somewhere between 1925 and maybe 1945. And one of their characteristics, and their strongest characteristics, are they're very practical and hardworking. One of the reasons for this is they just came from the Great Depression. They know what it's like to have to be very practical. I've talked to some people that are from this age, and they mentioned to me about some of their favorite Christmases growing up, and they said it was considered a privilege if you received a piece of candy and maybe a fruit. So usually it was an apple. If you were very lucky, it was an orange, because there just wasn't a lot of money going out at that time. So this group, not only did they grow up from the Great Depression, then they entered into World War II, and sources and resources was again kind of scarce during World War II. So if they weren't actually fighting overseas, they were dealing with scarce resources here in our country. They were very loyal and respectful to authority. The boss is always right. Verbal communication is their very best and favorite form to communicate. A lot of times they just like to come over to somebody's house just to visit, just to talk. They can be very resistant to change, and one of the reasons of this is because they have seen things not change in their lifetime, not as fast as we do. Whenever you buy an iPhone today, once you buy it, it's probably out of date before you get home. Let's think about the typewriter. The typewriter hadn't changed for years, and then in the late 70s we got electric typewriters, which still wasn't that much different than a normal typewriter. Now, of course, we've got computers, and we have spell check and grammar check, and now we do texting. So our generations are more comfortable with change compared to the Traditionalists. Now, they do appreciate very subtle acknowledgments that they have made a difference. There's a lot of people in this generation that are still working and are volunteering. And there's been some hospitals that have this generation as their volunteers, and whenever they have award ceremonies, a lot of these people won't show up because they don't want awards because of their volunteerism. They say, we just do it because this is our duty. Tom Brokaw, in one of his books, he called this generation, which would be the Traditionalists, the greatest generation. This generation really gave us a lot of the basis for the technology that we enjoy today. Some of the inventions that this generation, the Traditionalists, helped to give to the other generations that proceeded after them: the jet engine. We saw this take shape during World War II. So did digital electronics, the vacuum tubes and radar. That came out of World War II. And new surgical techniques. If you look back in history and you look at World War I and even the Civil War, they couldn't do a lot of surgeries on the front line. A lot of times if there was shrapnel in a leg, they had to cut the leg off. But in World War II, we ended up learning how to use penicillin better, learned how to use surgical techniques that they could actually bring the hospital from the United States to the front lines. And then we had to figure out a way to get the food from the United States to the front lines. So the scientists developed some of the best food storage processing, vacuum bagging that we see in our groceries today, and the freezer technology. All this came from this generation, and all this came from World War II, along with FM radio and the tape recorders. And for entertainment, this generation, when they had time after they got home from work, they were usually working in the farms or in the fields. But when they did get together for entertainment, they would sit around a radio. And as they sat around the radio programs would paint the pictures for them. You know, today we can watch TV, and a lot of scientists have proven that your mind is actually very inactive when you're watching TV. Why? Because everything is being painted for you. You are seeing the pictures. But whenever you listen to radio, you have to think of what you believe that villain to look like, what you believe the setting to look like. So this generation had very good imaginations. And if we look at Ashland in this generation, this is a picture of the Ventura Hotel between the late 1930s and early 1950s. This is located down where Burger King is now on Winchester Avenue. And this is another picture of the Ventura Hotel. The Paramount would be located towards the left. And yet another picture, you can see the Ventura Hotel in the foreground, and in the background you can see the sign of the Paramount. This is an area that is located at the bottom of the hill from Ashland Community and Technical College. If you drive up 13th Street and you look over and you see the tennis courts, this is the area that some people used to live in. This is a picture that this generation would have remembered. One of the best ways of transportation was railroad. And this is where the PNC Bank is, where they call it the Depot Bank. This was actually the main train depot in Ashland. And here is King's Daughters Hospital. Doesn't look anything like it does today, but this first generation, the Traditionalist, would have remembered this hospital as being one of the most unique hospitals in the area, and actually one of the first hospitals. Here we have a bird's eye view of Ashland that the Traditionalists would have remembered. And if you see that building right down there at the bottom, that was actually the first high school. This is located where Central Park is now. This is a better picture of that school, and this is located exactly on the corner where Crab School is, right by the Ashland Bowie County Library at Central Park. And this is the very first college. This was before it was Ashland Community College. It was Ashland Business School, located down on Carter Avenue. Here we have the first YMCA in Ashland. This generation would have frequented this place, and this was located where the Bob Evans is today. And this generation would have seen steamboats coming in and out of the wharf down at Ashland. And this was one of the main means of transportation that the early Traditionalists would have been aware of. Went from Cincinnati to Huntington and Portsmouth. Between rail car and steamboat, this is the way a lot of the people would travel. They'd either travel by rail to Cincinnati or by steamboat or paddle wheel to Cincinnati and then get on a train. And did you know that in Central Park there used to be a horse track? Yep, right down in the middle of the park. This generation would have remembered that. And of course, Cliffside Park was a park that was right before this generation. It closed down in the early 1920s, but the park located where the Ashland water plant is now, actually had a roller coaster. And here's another picture of Cliffside Park. Highway 23 would be in the background. And this is the roller coaster that was located in Ashland for about 25 years. Now, this generation has a few liabilities. One of them, that they cannot handle ambiguity. In other words, if you're working with people from this generation, they don't like for you to say, well, you need to get this project done at this certain time. No, they don't like that because they want you to give them an exact time. They don't like any kind of ambiguity. They're also reluctant to buck the system. Why? Because one of the characteristics we said was they were loyal, very loyal to employers, to their boss. So if you say something that they're not crazy about, if you're the supervisor, they're still going to give you complete respect. This is some of the entertainment that they would have been used to at their time, the big band music and the early radio shows. And this is the type of childhood environment that they would have grown up with. Do you notice anything about the houses? Does something look similar to you in both of these pictures? It's probably the front porch. Because the front porch, that was really another room. They used to use that to meet people. Individuals at the end of the day would come out on the front porch and they would talk to their neighbors. This was the very first thing that you saw whenever you entered the house because it was a greeting place, a way to meet. Now you can compare that with houses today, and what do you notice? No front porch. Because we have lost that verbal communication first. Now, a lot of houses, you have garages at the front. And usually we have so much stuff in the garages that we can't even park a car in the garage. So the design of houses has actually adapted to the generations. After this generation, when the World War II was over, this generation came home, and we had all this technology and no competition. Japan, China, Germany, Great Britain, Russia, Spain, Italy, they were all out of commission because of the way that the war had affected them. It either bankrupted them or they were destroyed not only financially but physically. So we had all this technology that we brought back to the country, and now we changed this technology into entertainment purposes. So the children that grew up between 1943 up to 1960, they got to grow up with all this technology. The technology like from TVs now, better radios, records, more radio stations. This generation had all this scientific information that came from World War II, so some of their characteristics is they valued learning. But they were also called the me generation because every generation, every parent wants their kids to have what they didn't have. Well, this generation was given a lot of things. Now, their parents was very loyal to authority or to their bosses. This generation was become more accustomed to giving feedback. This generation is considered the largest generation. And some of the events that this generation would have remembered would be Woodstock, Beatlemania when the Beatles first landed in the United States, Vietnam, and By the World of Coke. This is where commercials first started. They started advertising because they had a large audience. They would also have remembered the Cuban Missile Crisis. After World War II, we had the jet technology that we got from Germany, and we ended up exploring space. We had the space race between the United States and Russia. And then Russia developed the same type of technology, and we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. We had Woodstock, where now music is going to change the world. And in the 1960s in Ashland, in Bowie County, this is where we saw a lot of the industries jump into existence. Here's a picture of Calgon Carbon in Calixburg. This is a picture of the Ashland Technical College on Roberts Drive, the Roberts Drive campus. This is a picture of Evans Grocery, which is located across from the tennis courts below Ashland Community and Technical College. This is the dedication from the Summit Prison out in Summit, Bowie County. This is the dedication to Scope Towers, which is located on Winchester Avenue, close to the 29th Street intersection. And there's another apartment complex in Calixburg that was also built at this time. And here we have Highway 23 going from Ashland to Russell with the train tracks on the right-hand side. This was developed into a 4-lane highway in the 60s. Now comparing to King's Daughters to the Traditionalist generation, now King's Daughters has grown since the city of Ashland and Bowie County and Greenup County has gotten bigger, and we've gotten better medical technology thanks to the World War II generation. Now King's Daughters have started to grow. Now this particular generation, the baby boomers, they view money as a motivator. Money can be a great motivator if retirement funds have not been accumulated. And this generation hasn't accumulated all the retirement funds that they need. That's why this generation are staying in the workforce a lot longer. Now the traditionalists, they like to stay in the work world because that's what they value as work. This generation values money just a little bit more than work, but they are still in this work field. Problem is, when they all retire, now we have to figure out how do we pay the retirement for them. Some of the liabilities of the baby boomer generation is they're not naturally budget-minded. Why? Well, if you look at one of the inventions over on the right-hand side, we see credit cards. This generation developed the buy now, pay it later method of finance. And now this generation owes a lot of money, and now they're paying for their children and even their grandchildren, trying to raise an entire family again. So this generation values the money just a little bit more than the actual work itself. And over on the right-hand side, we can see all the inventions that this generation took from the traditionalists, and they used their technology and gave us the following, especially with air conditioning. If you look at a map of the United States, you can find out where the most populated cities were before air conditioning and then the most populated cities after air conditioning. Before air conditioning, they were all in North, Philadelphia, Boston, Cleveland. And after air conditioning, population started moving south, Miami, San Antonio, and Houston. And traditionalists and boomers may have tendency not to question or challenge authority or the status quo. This may cause confusion and resentment among the next two generations that we're going to talk about, because the next two generations, they've been taught to speak up and speak their mind. The baby boomers, they had children, and this group of children are called the Generation Xers. Between 1960 and roughly 1980, this generation was born. Some of the characteristics that they have is they're called latchkey generations. Why are they called latchkey? Well, now for the first time, both parents are normally working outside of the home. So after school, the parents would give the children the key to get into the house, and now we have microwave technology. Usually the kid could come in and grab some food from the refrigerator and throw it in the microwave, and then they would sit in front of TV. So this generation, these kids were staying at home and being able to take care of themselves until their parents got home. And this generation was the first generation to grow up with technology. This generation had video games. Atari. They had VHS, video recorders. They grew up watching MTV. And it didn't take long for advertisers to realize that they had a audience. So advertisers started marketing to this generation. If they were watching cartoons, the commercials were about toys. So this generation was the first generation to grow up with not only advertising, but with a lot of the technology that we use today. And these are some of the TV shows that was marketed to this generation, which is why we call it the latchkey generation. A lot of these TV shows would actually come on right around 3 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon because they knew that's when the children got off of school. And we see some of the games that this generation grew up with: Pong and Pac-Man. Now, some of the liabilities with this generation is now they're very impatient. Why? Well, the baby boomers, like all good parents, want to give their children what they didn't have. So this generation started getting things quicker. Now we have drive-through gas stations. Now they had drive-through McDonald's, microwaves. Everything was at your fingertips. Remote control TVs. So this generation was a little more impatient than their parents and their grandparents. This generation, unlike their parents and grandparents, prefer to let the supervisor see what is right and what is wrong, as opposed to trying to impress them with strictly good news. And the most important thing to this generation is employers' recognition that they must have a balance between their work and non-work lives. This generation valued more time off rather than time at work. Here we have some of the inventions: Post-it notes. And then they took the tape players that the baby boomers had given us and condensed them into Walkmans. And the VCRs got a little bit better. Now, besides having a beta and a VHS, now they were all VHS. And the very first personal computers, usually a Tandy, was given to this generation. And Ashland looks about the same as it does today with this generation. Thanks to the previous generations that helped build all the business and industries, now this generation was the first to enjoy the fruits of their labor. The Generation Xers as parents. There's one term that you probably haven't heard of before. The term is called helicopter parents. In other words, this generation is the first generation that hovers over their kids. I've heard of a lot of people talking about whenever their children graduate from college that this generation has asked, believe it or not, to sit in on the job interviews with their kids. This has happened a lot of times. There was a story that was in USA Today about a lot of the Fortune 500 companies have decided to let this generation, their parents, which would be the Generation Xers, to sit in on some of the big job interviews. Some of the things that this generation remembers is the Space Shuttle Challenge disaster, the Cold War that was extended from the baby boomers. Now, the baby boomers had Woodstock. This generation thought they could save the world through music, and they had Live Aid. In this generation, their children are called the Millennials, or Generation Y, born between 1980 and roughly 2000. One of the top and main characteristics for this generation is they're adept at technology and using technology in the workplace. They've grown up with technology, and they're used to change because the technology they grow up with changes quickly. The learning curve has been shortened drastically. can be bored easily because of being used to having their their stimuli satisfied so quickly. Because now not only do they have TVs with remote controls, but now we've got 3 and 4 and 500 channels. Then we have Netflix, we have the internet, we have iPhones, iPads. All the information you need is at the tips of your fingers, and they can be accessed almost anywhere at any time. But then again, every generation wants to spoil their children, so this generation has been spoiled by their parents who were the Generation Xers. But this generation likes to have more feedback. How am I doing? Now, compare and contrast this between their great-grandparents from the Traditionalist, who they usually don't want any type of feedback. So Generation Xers and Millennials, who have had different life experience and communicate with people differently, may fail to actively listen to the baby boomers and the Traditionalists, thereby missing valuable information and guidance. That's why I try to tell all of my students, if you know people that are in their 70s, 80s, talk to them and try to get all this information that they have. They have some valuable experiences. And yes, that generation is still in the workforce. I know quite a few people that are in their early 80s that are still working. 2 that I know, one is an accountant and one is a manager. And guess what? The people from that generation, they have let technology come into their lives, and they have adapted technology into their work field as well. So we're going to be working with these people. We're going to see these people out in the workforce, and we need to figure out what are the differences between the generations. How do you manage generations like that? 15, 20 years from now, depending on what position and career that you choose, you may be in supervision. And you may be in supervision over somebody that is a millennial, a couple of Generation Xers, and 3 or 4 baby boomers. They all have different worldviews and different experiences. Now it's become your job to be able to make a mesh and to manage them. This generation would remember maybe 9/11. They may have been in grade school, but over here on the right-hand side, they have seen jump drives and iPhones and iPads change drastically.